I was present on the observation spire of the Reliquary of Sorrows when the Hive Mind first made landfall on Ocularis Prime, a world defined by its proximity to the Astronomican's searing psychic wake. For 12,000 years, we have lived in the shadow of that golden pulse, but we never understood its weight until the great devourer tried to swallow it. The atmosphere did not merely burn, it curdled. The biological psychic shadow of the Tyranid fleet colliding with the Emperor's radiance like cold water hitting molten iron. I felt the pressure in my sinus cavities turn into a sharp, metallic screeching as the astropaths began to liquefy in their harnesses. We watched through the reinforced quartz as the first spores descended, not into darkness, but into a blinding, holy luminescence that began to unmake their very genetic code before they even touched the soil. If you still walk beside me through fire and scripture, then bear witness. Subscribe, share this burden, and let others hear the truth buried beneath hymns. The resonance of the God, Emperor's will is not a metaphor to those of us who have spent decades tethered to the Navis Nobilite or the Scholastia Psychana. It is a physical weight, a pressure in the marrow that tastes of ozone and ancient iron. On Ocularis Prime, that weight became a localized supernova of the soul. I remember the sound of the vox casters throughout the spire beginning to bleed a low, frequency hum that vibrated the teeth in my gums. A sound that occurs only when the veil between the Materium and the Empyrean thins to the point of transparency. We were a world of reliquaries and orbital batteries, a linchpin in the segmentum's spiritual defense. But as the Hive fleet approached, the very air seemed to revolt against their presence. The Tyranid is a void where the soul should be, a predatory hunger that silences the warp. Yet as their leading tendrils breached the outer atmosphere, they did not bring silence. They brought a scream. It was not a scream of vocal cords or chitinous plates grinding together, but a psychic shriek that tore through the ship's lower decks, causing the thralls to tear their own eyes out to stop the seeing. I stood by the primary viewing port, the cold of the void seeping through the reinforced glass, and watched as the golden aura of the planet's defense grid flared with a sudden, violent intensity. It was as if the world itself recognized the ultimate blasphemy of the swarm and had decided to ignite. The Tyranid spores, usually so resilient that they can survive the friction of atmospheric entry without a scratch, began to blacken and curl like dead leaves in a furnace. They were being rejected by the light. This was not the heat of friction. It was the heat of holy judgment, a metaphysical friction where the shadow in the warp met the lighthouse of humanity. I could smell the ozone thickening in the bridge, mixing with the stale, recycled air and the copper tang of my own nosebleed. The logic of the Hive Mind is total, a singular consciousness of consumption, but in that moment, I saw the first signs of something I had never associated with the Xenos hesitation. The swarms did not dive, they recoiled. They hovered in the upper thermosphere, their ships twitching and pulsing with a frantic, bioluminescent rhythm that spoke of a deep, systemic shock. My hands trembled as I adjusted the long-range picked feeds, zooming in on a single Titan drifting in the high orbit. Its massive, translucent wings were usually a deep, bruised purple, but under the glare of the Emperor's light, they were turning a sickly, translucent yellow. The flesh sloughing off in great, wet clumps that vaporized before they hit the clouds. The creature was being unmade by the mere proximity to the world's sanctified aura. It was a sight of terrifying beauty, a reminder that the master of mankind does not just protect his subjects, he erodes his enemies at the level of their very essence. The deck plates beneath my boots groaned, the ship's machine spirit howling in sympathetic resonance with the psychic storm brewing outside. Every servitor in the observation bay had frozen in place, their wet, where processors whirring at a pitch that suggested imminent meltdown. We were witnessing a collision of two absolute forces, the hunger that had consumed galaxies and the light that had held the stars in place for 10 millennia. I felt a strange, detached sense of doom. knowing that to be a witness to such a confluence was to be changed forever. The light was not gentle, it was a scoring thing, a sandpaper of the spirit that stripped away the comfort of ignorance. I saw the clouds below part in a massive, circular ripple, revealing the primary cathedral spire of the capital city, and from its apex, a beam of pure, unadulterated radiance shot upward, piercing the heart of the swarming hive. The light did not just hit the bio-ships, it seemed to inhabit them, turning their organic hulls into glowing lanterns of agony. It was the first time I realized that the Emperor's mercy is a fire, and the Tyranid, for all its evolutionary perfection, has no defense against a god. The air in the spire was now so thick with static that my hair stood on end, and every metal surface I touched sparked with a blue, haunting flame. I turned back to the consoles, my vision blurring with spots of gold, and began to record the telemetry, my fingers dancing over keys that were slick with the condensation of a dying world's final breath. The logs will show that the Tyranid fleet slowed its descent by a factor of 40% in those first 20 minutes, a deceleration that defied every known tactical pattern of the swarm. They were afraid, or perhaps, more accurately, the hive mind was experiencing a sensory overload so profound that the individual organisms were simply shutting down, their nervous systems unable to process the sheer volume of psychic data being forced into them by the Astronomican's reflection. I saw harpies and gargoyles falling from the sky in their thousands, not shot down by flak, but simply ceasing to fly, their wings folding as if they had forgotten how to exist. They hit the ruins of the industrial districts like rain, a biological deluge that clogged the vents and choked the manufacturing pipes. But the light did not stop at the sky. It followed them down. It seeped into the shadows where the lictors hid and burned the moisture from their hides. It was a total war of the intangible against the biological, and for the first time in my long service to the Inquisition, I felt a flicker of something resembling hope, though it was a cold, sharp hope that felt more like a blade in the gut than a comfort. We are taught from birth that the Emperor protects, but on Ocularis Prime, we learned that his protection is a radioactive thing, a searing purity that demands everything and gives back only the silence of the pyre. As the first chapter of this invasion closed, I looked out at the burning horizon and knew that the world was already lost, not to the Tyranids, but to the very salvation that was currently roasting them alive. The vibration in the deck reached a crescendo, a bone, deep thrum that made the glass of my chronometer shatter, the shards falling like diamonds onto the cold, rusted floor. I didn't care. I couldn't look away from the golden death unfolding in the stars. The Tyranids had come for a feast, but they had found a star, and even a god. Beast can be blinded if it stares too long into the sun. I reached for the Vox, linked to signal the orbital batteries, but my hand stopped halfway. There was no need. The light was doing the work of 10,000 cannons. It was a baptism of fire for a race that knew only the dark between the galaxies. And I was the only one left in the spire who was still sane enough to understand the horror of what we were winning. The smell of burning chitin reached the filtration system, a sweet, cloying stench like roasting meat mixed with chemicals, and I felt my stomach heave. This was the cost of a miracle. This was the weight of the throne. Each second felt like an eternity, the time stretching out under the gravity of the psychic event, until the past and the future seemed to vanish, leaving only the blinding, golden present and the sound of a billion alien minds screaming in unison as they were burned out of the universe. The golden inundation did not merely shatter the physical shells of the invading swarm. It acted as a solvent upon the very fabric of their collective consciousness. To understand the gravity of what occurred on Ocularis Prime, one must first grasp the absolute nature of the shadow in the warp. It is a psychic null zone, a smothering blanket of static that usually snuffs out the light of the soul, leaving only the cold, hard reality of the predator and the prey. But as the Hive fleet dipped its tendrils into the atmosphere of a world so saturated with the Emperor's essence, the shadow did not consume the light. The light consumed the shadow. I stood at my station, the air tasting of ozone and the copper tang of a looming seizure, and watched the telemetry data scroll across my slate in a frantic, unreadable blur. The synaptic nodes, those towering, brain-pulsing ships that command the lesser broods, were the first to show signs of metaphysical distress. Through the long, range-picked casters, I saw a Hive ship, a vessel the size of a continental plate, begin to shudder with a rhythmic violence that suggested its internal organs were attempting to flee its own hull. It was not being hit by macro cannon fire or lance strikes. It was being hollowed out from within by the sheer psychic resonance of the Astronomican's reflection. The creature's bioluminescent pores, which usually glowed with a dull, menacing red, began to pulse with a frantic, blinding white light. It was as if the creature had swallowed a star and was now being digested by its own meal. I watched as the lower decks of our own station descended into a state of religious hysteria. The men and women who served the Emperor in the darkness of the void are not strangers to the supernatural, but this was something beyond the typical rituals of the ecclesiarchy. The ratings were falling to their knees, not in prayer, but in a state of catatonic shock. They could feel it, the raw, unshielded power of a god manifesting in the physical realm. The air in the observation bay became so thick with psychic static that every movement felt like pushing through waist-deep water. I saw a group of tech, adepts attempting to calibrate the void shields, their mechanical limbs sparking with blue flame as the machine spirits of the station began to sing in a haunting, discordant chorus. They were no longer following the protocols of the Omnisia. They were weeping, the oil from their bionic eyes mixing with the grime of the deck. I realized then that the Tyranids were not the only ones being affected. We were all being exposed to a purity that the human mind was never meant to handle. It was a scoring of the spirit. I felt my own memories beginning to fray at the edges, the petty grievances of my life, the rivalries, the fears, the hunger for promotion, all of it being bleached away by the golden glare. I was being emptied, turned into a vessel for a purpose I could not name. The Tyranid swarm on the surface fared even worse. In the valleys between the great Hive spires, where the darkness is usually absolute, the light found its way. It seeped into the vents, crawled through the sewer pipes, and illuminated the deepest, most secret spawning pools. I saw picked feeds of hormagaunts entering a state of total paralysis. These are creatures that exist only to kill, driven by a relentless hunger that ignores pain and fear. Yet, as the golden radiance touched them, they stopped. They did not retreat. They did not fight. They simply stood in the ash-choked streets, their scything talons drooping, their heads tilted toward the sky as if they were listening to a sound that only they could hear. Then, one by one, they began to undergo a horrific transformation. Their carapaces didn't just break, they dissolved into a fine, white powder. The biological matter within was being converted into pure energy. The carbon and protein of their bodies, unable to maintain their cohesion in the presence of such overwhelming holiness. It was a mass extinction event of a spiritual nature. The Hive Mind, that vast, alien intellect that spans galaxies, was being forced to experience the one thing it had never known: the presence of a superior authority. The weight of this realization hit me like a physical blow. The Tyranids are not evil in the way we understand it. They are a force of nature, a fire that seeks only to burn. But the Emperor is the sun that the fire cannot consume. I saw a swarmlord, a creature of immense tactical genius and psychic power, emerge from a mycetic spore in the center of the Cathedral of St. Gallo. It stood amidst the burning pews, its four blades shimmering with a faint, psychic miasma. It looked up at the stained glass windows, which were being backlit by the divine fire of the orbital bombardment, and for a brief second, the creature's posture changed. It didn't roar. It didn't charge. It seemed to shrink, its massive frame trembling, as if it were a child standing before an angry father. The Swarmlord, a beast that has conquered 1,000 worlds, was experiencing humility. It was a sight that should have been triumphant, but it filled me with a cold, hollow dread. If a god can do this to a creature of such power, what does he think of us, his flawed and broken children? The Vox comms were a cacophony of madness. I heard captains of the Imperial Guard screaming that their enemies were turning into pillars of salt. I heard priests declaring that the end of days had arrived, their voices cracking with a mixture of joy and terror, and beneath it all, the constant, low, frequency thrum of the ship's engines, which had taken on a melodic quality, as if the metal itself were trying to pray. I turned my attention back to the orbital theater, where the Tyranid hive ships were now attempting to flee. They were turning their massive, fleshy bulks away from the planet, their bio-thrusters venting clouds of superheated gas. But the light followed them. It reached out like golden fingers, snagging the trailing tentacles of the Kraken ships and pulling them back into the atmospheric furnace. There was no escape. The void itself was being sanctified. I saw a bio ship the size of a city simply vanish, its matter replaced by a flash of white light so intense that it burnt out the sensors on my console. When the image returned, there was nothing left but a cloud of glittering dust, reflecting the distant stars. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, a sensation of my heart being squeezed by an invisible hand. I slumped against the cold iron of the control desk, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked down at my hands and saw that they were glowing, not with fire, but with a soft, translucent light that seemed to emanate from my very bones. I realized with a shock that I was dying, but it was not the death I had expected. I was being recycled, my essence being drawn into the great golden tide that was currently purging the world of the Xenos. I felt a sense of profound peace, a detachment from the physical world that was both beautiful and terrifying. I could see the connections between all things, the way the iron of the ship was linked to the souls of the crew, the way the blood in my veins was a part of the Emperor's own life force. It was a moment of total clarity, a vision of the universe as a single, divine machine, and I was but a tiny, insignificant gear within it. But then the darkness returned. Not the darkness of the Tyranids, but the darkness of reality. The light began to fade, the intense psychic pressure receding as the planetary towers reached the limits of their endurance. The primary spire, the one that had been venting the most intense energy, began to crumble, its structural integrity compromised by the sheer volume of power it had been forced to channel. I watched as the great Gothic arches collapsed, the stone and steel falling into the streets below in a slow, motion cascade of rubble. The golden beam flickered and died, leaving the world in a state of bruised twilight. The Tyranid swarms that remained were no longer the coherent, terrifying force they had been. They were broken, fragmented, their psychic link to the hive mind severed or scrambled beyond repair. They wandered the ruins like lost animals, their predatory instincts replaced by a profound, catatonic confusion. I hauled myself back up to my feet, my muscles aching as if I had run a marathon. The glow in my skin had faded, leaving behind a dull, grey pallor. I looked around the bridge and saw that I was the only one still standing. The others were either dead or unconscious, their bodies sprawled across the decks like discarded dolls. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional spark from a ruined console or the distant, muffled sound of a whole plate groaning. I looked out the window at the planet below. It was a graveyard for the Tyranids, and a graveyard for the world we had known. Ocularis Prime would never be the same. Its soil was now saturated with the ash of 1 billion aliens and the psychic residue of a miracle. It was a holy place, but it was also a place of utter desolation. I realized then that the Emperor's light is not a gift that can be received without cost. It is a flame that consumes everything it touches, leaving behind only the purest, most essential elements, The sensors began to beep again, a slow, rhythmic pulse that signaled the arrival of a new threat. I looked at the screen and saw a second Tyranid fleet emerging from the warp on the edge of the system. They had seen what had happened to the first wave. They had felt the scream of the Hive Mind as it was burned. And they were coming anyway. The hunger was too great, the need to consume too absolute. They were like moths drawn to a flame, even if that flame was a god. I felt a surge of exhaustion, a desire to simply close my eyes and let the darkness take me. But I knew I couldn't. I was a witness. I had seen the light, and it was my duty to record what had happened, to ensure that the memory of this miracle was preserved, even if the world it saved was eventually consumed. I reached for the backup data slate, my fingers trembling as I began to upload the logs to the Inquisition's secure servers. I knew that when they read these records, they wouldn't see the beauty or the peace I had felt. They would only see the tactical data, the casualty counts, the loss of infrastructure. They would miss the most important part, the fact that for a single, brief moment, the universe had been perfect. I looked out at the approaching fleet, the thousands of ships looking like a swarm of insects against the backdrop of the cold, unfeeling stars. They were beautiful in their own way, a testament to the endless variety of life in the galaxy. But they were also a reminder of the darkness that always lurks just beyond the light. I felt a sudden, fierce pride in my species, in our ability to endure such horror and still find the strength to stand. We are the children of the Emperor, and we are forged in the fire of his will. We may be broken, we may be flawed, but we are his. And as long as his light continues to burn, the darkness will never truly win. I sat back in my chair, the cold of the ship finally reaching my bones, and waited for the second wave to arrive. I was ready. I had seen the light, and nothing, not even the great Devourer, could take that away from me. The air in the bay was cold now, the heaters having failed long ago, and I could see my breath frosting in the air. It looked like tiny, frozen stars floating in the dark. I closed my eyes and listened to the silence, waiting for the first sound of the new invasion, the first scratching of talons against the hull. But it didn't come. Instead, there was only the sound of my own heartbeat, a steady, rhythmic pulse that seemed to echo the fading resonance of the golden light. I was alone, but I was not afraid. I had seen the face of God, and he was a fire that never goes out. The deck plates vibrated again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the psychic thrum of the light or the mechanical roar of the engines. It was something else, a deep, rhythmic thudding that sounded like a drumbeat. I realized it was the sound of the orbital batteries firing, their massive shells screaming through the void to meet the new threat. The war was not over. It was only beginning. But the terms had changed. The Tyranids now knew what they were up against. They knew that there was a power in this galaxy that they could not consume, a light that they could not extinguish, and we knew it too. We knew that we were not just fighting for survival, we were fighting for the very soul of the universe. I opened my eyes and looked at the screen, watching as the first of the new ships was hit by a macro cannon shell, its body exploding in a shower of gore and ice. I felt a grim satisfaction. Let them come. Let them see what it means to face the Emperor's light. We are ready for them. We have been forged in the fire, and we will not be consumed. As the second chapter of this nightmare unfolded, I found myself thinking of the priests back on Terra, the ones who spend their lives in the shadow of the Golden Throne. I wondered if they truly understood the power they served. I wondered if they knew that the light they worshipped was a weapon of such terrible beauty that it could unmake the very stars. I hoped they didn't. Some things are better left unknown. Some truths are too heavy for the human mind to bear. I turned my attention back to the consoles, my fingers moving with a new purpose. I had work to do. I had to record the end of the world, and I had to do it with the same clinical, detached precision that the Inquisition demanded. I was no longer just a witness, I was a chronicler of the divine, and as the first ships entered the system's inner rim, I began to write. The history of the Imperium is written in blood, but on Ocularis Prime, it was written in light. It was a chapter that would be debated by scholars and inquisitors for centuries to come, a moment of divine intervention that defied every law of physics and theology. But for me, it was something simpler. It was the moment I realized that even in the darkest, most hopeless corners of the galaxy, there is always a light. And sometimes, that light is enough to change everything. I watched as the sky above the planet began to glow again, a faint, flickering amber that suggested the planetary choir was trying to reform. It was a desperate, suicidal effort, but it was enough to make the Tyranid fleet hesitate once more. They remembered the pain. They remembered the scream, and in that hesitation, there was a chance, a small, flickering chance for survival. I leaned forward, my eyes fixed on the display, and prayed for the first time in years. Not for my own life, but for the light to return, for the fire to burn again. Because without it, we were nothing but meat for the swarm. And the Emperor knows, we have given enough of ourselves to the dark. The first of the enemy's vanguard reached the upper atmosphere, their hulls glowing red from the friction of entry. I waited for the golden pulse, for the scoring heat of the divine fire. But it didn't come. Instead, there was only the sound of the wind howling through the ruins below and the steady, rhythmic thumping of the orbital guns. The miracle was over. The light had done its work, and now it was up to us to finish it. I felt a sharp pang of disappointment, a sense of loss that was almost physical. But then I looked at the data slate in my hand, at the records of what had happened, and I realized that the light hadn't really gone away. It was still there, in the memories of the survivors, in the ash of the dead, in the very air of the world. It had left its mark, and as long as we remembered it, it would never truly be gone. I stood up, my legs shaking but holding firm, and prepared to face the new day. The war would go on, the darkness would continue to press in, but for one brief, glorious moment, we had seen the truth. We had seen the Emperor's light, and we had seen it win. The silence on the bridge was no longer oppressive, it was expectant. I looked out at the stars and saw not a void, but a battlefield, a place where the light and the dark were locked in an eternal struggle, and where every soul was a soldier. I was ready to do my part. I was ready to be a witness, a chronicler, a servant of the throne. I reached for the Vox link and opened a channel to the remaining orbital platforms. My voice was raspy, cracked from the ozone and the screaming, but it was steady. "This is the observation spire," I said, the words echoing through the empty bridge. "We are still here. The light has shown us the way. Target the lead ships for the Emperor," and as the guns roared in response, I knew that the story of Ocularis Prime was far from over. It was just beginning. The secondary wave did not descend with the mindless momentum of the first. It arrived with a chilling, calculated caution that suggested the Hive Mind had processed the trauma of its preceding loss and was now attempting to adapt its biological machinery to withstand the divine. On the bridge of the Reliquary of Sorrows, the air had grown cold. Not the refreshing chill of a functioning environmental system, but the soul, sapping frost of the void creeping through failing heat exchangers. I watched the tactical holith flicker, its ancient amber light casting long, trembling shadows across the corpses of my fellow officers. The new arrivals were different. Their carapaces were not the bruised purple of the previous brood. They were a dull, matte gray, coated in a thick, gelatinous layer of psychically absorbent slime that seemed to swallow the ambient light of the stars. They were evolving in real time, attempting to build a biological insulator against the Emperor's radiance. I reached for a nutrient paste tube, my fingers stiff and numb, and felt the gritty texture of ash on the plastic. It was everywhere now, the powdered remains of a billion Xenos organisms, filtered through the ship's vents and settling on every surface like a gray, blasphemous snow. The psychic pressure had not vanished. It had merely changed its frequency. Where before it had been a blinding, white-hot scream, it was now a low, rhythmic thrumming that felt like a heavy heart beating against the inside of my ribs. The astropaths who had survived the first contact were no longer screaming. They were chanting in a dead tongue, their voices a dry rasp that sounded like sandpaper on bone. I ignored them, focusing instead on the long-range scans of the planetary surface. The capital city of Ocularis Prime was a jagged tooth of stone and iron, its spires broken and its streets choked with the slurry of dissolved biomass. But the survivors of the local PDF and the remnants of the Saurators were moving. I saw the heat signatures of flamers clearing the clogged vents of the manufactorums, the holy promethium carving paths through the piles of twitching, paralyzed Tyranid organisms. The light had broken the back of the initial assault, but the planet was now a charnel house, and the smell, even through the ship's filtration, was an oily, cloying stench of cooked protein and ancient incense. I adjusted the frequency of the Vox array, trying to find a clear channel amidst the static of the approaching swarm. What I heard was not a plea for help, but a recording on an endless loop from the Cathedral of St. Gallo. It was the voice of the canoness, her tone devoid of fear, reciting the litany of the unfailing light. Behind her voice, I could hear the rhythmic clanging of a great bell and the screeching of Tyranid organisms, trying to find a way through the sanctified gates. The Tyranids of the second wave were landing now, their mycetic spores trailing black smoke as they steered away from the residual golden pools of energy that still simmered in the craters. They were being smarter. They were landing in the industrial wastes, the places where the smog and the heavy metal runoff provided a physical shroud against the sky. I felt a surge of bitter resentment. They were treating our miracle as a mere environmental hazard, an obstacle to be bypassed by a shift in their genetic coding. The first of the Grey Bio ships began to deploy its payload over the northern polar refineries. These were not the swarming hormagaunts or the skittering termagants of the first wave. These were specialized organisms, bulky, slow-moving beasts with massive, reinforced crests that acted as mobile lightning rods for psychic energy. As they touched down, I saw the air around them ripple with a dark, oily distortion. They were projecting their own localized shadow in the warp, a pocket of absolute nothingness designed to anchor the rest of the swarm. It was a counter-miracle, a biological blasphemy that sought to snuff out the lingering warmth of the Emperor's grace. I watched as a squad of seraphim dived from the clouds, their jump, packs trailing white smoke, only to be swatted out of the air by the invisible pressure of the new shadow. They didn't burn. They simply stopped, their engines failing, their bodies falling like stones into the dark. The bridge groaned again, a deep, structural protest that vibrated the soles of my boots. I looked at the hull integrity monitors and saw red bleeding across the schematic of the mid-decks. We were being boarded, not by spores, but by boarding leeches' fleshy tooth-lined tubes that had latched onto our hull under the cover of the debris field. I drew my service pistol, the weight of the iron a small comfort in the face of the encroaching dark. I could hear the wet, rhythmic thudding of the leeches boring tongues through the deck plates. They were coming for the logs. They were coming for me. The Hive Mind knew that I was a witness, that I carried the data of its failure, and it wanted that knowledge back. It wanted to consume the memory of its own defeat, so it could refine its next assault. I felt a sudden, cold clarity. I was no longer just an observer. I was a carrier of a holy contagion. The truth of the light was a virus to the great devourer, and I was the primary host. I began the emergency data, purge of the non-essential systems, rerouting all power to the Vox caster and the long-range transmission array. I would broadcast the telemetry of the miracle on every frequency, into every corner of the subsector. If I was to be consumed, my final act would be to scream the Emperor's truth into the void, until the stars themselves took notice. I felt the first of the boarding, Leeches breached the bulkheads of the lower bridge. The sound was like a wet rag being torn in half, followed by the high-pitched shriek of a ripper swarm flooding the corridor. I didn't look at the door. I kept my eyes on the data stream, watching as the percentages of the upload ticked upward with agonizing slowness. 40%. 42. The air was getting thinner. The oxygen scrubbers finally giving up the ghost. I could feel the pressure in my skull building again. A return of the metallic taste that signaled the presence of the warp. The door to the bridge buckled. A thick, grey tentacle, covered in pulsing veins and dripping with acidic bile, forced its way through the gap. It didn't lash out, it seemed to be tasting the air, searching for the source of the psychic resonance that had wounded its collective soul. I fired my pistol, the recoil jarring my shoulder, the bolt round detonating inside the fleshy mass. A spray of yellow ichor coated the consoles, hissing as it ate through the ancient wiring. The tentacle withdrew, but I knew more were coming. The hive mind was no longer acting with hunger, it was acting with spite. It wanted to erase the anomaly of Ocularis Prime from the cosmic record. I looked out the window one last time. The planet was disappearing behind a veil of grey spores, a literal shroud being drawn over the world that had dared to shine. But beneath that shroud, I could still see the faint, stubborn glimmers of gold, the fires that would not be put out, the souls that refused to be quiet. 50%. The transmission was halfway through. I could hear the scratching of thousands of tiny claws on the other side of the door now, a sound like a hailstorm on a tin roof. I thought of the Emperor sitting on his throne of gold 1,000,000 light years away. Does he feel the pain of his children? Or is he, too, just a force of nature, a sun that burns because it must, indifferent to the lives it sustains or destroys? I realized it didn't matter. The light was the only thing that stood between us and the absolute dark of the swarm. It was enough to know that it existed. I felt a strange, detached sense of peace. The fear that had defined my life for the last few hours was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I would not be meat. I would be a beacon. I reached for a second magazine, my movements precise and deliberate, and waited for the door to fail. The final breach came not from the door, but from the ceiling. A carnifex, its matte, grey armor scarred by the earlier radiation of the light, crashed through the reinforced plating of the upper deck, landing amidst the wreckage of the navigation consoles. It was a monster of pure, distilled violence, its scything talons the size of power swords. It looked at me, its small, red eyes reflecting the dying light of the holith. It didn't roar. It didn't charge. It seemed to be waiting. It was a synaptic conduit, a direct line to the hive mind. I could feel its gaze sliding over my mind, searching for the data slate, searching for the memory of the golden fire. I smiled, a bloody, ragged thing, and held up the slate. "You're too late," I whispered, my voice lost in the hum of the ship. "The light is already out there. You can't catch it." The creature lunged, and I felt the world dissolve into a blur of grey chitin and cold iron. But even as the darkness closed in, I saw the green light on the console turn to a solid, unwavering steady glow. 100%. The message was away. The miracle was recorded. Ocularis Prime might fall, and I might die, but the hive mind now had a wound that would never heal. The knowledge that there is a fire in this galaxy that even it cannot swallow. I felt a sharp, sudden coldness as the first talon pierced my chest, but it didn't hurt. It felt like being submerged in a deep, dark ocean, and as my vision faded, I saw one last thing, a tiny, distant flicker of gold in the darkness of the void, a single star that refused to go out. It was enough. The darkness that followed was not the absence of light, but the presence of something far older and more predatory. I awoke to the rhythmic, wet thrumming of the reliquary of sorrows as it drifted, no longer a vessel of the Imperial Navy, but a hollowed-out carcass being digested by the swarm. I was pinned beneath the wreckage of the primary Vox station, my left leg a numb weight of shattered bone and twisted iron, But the carnifex that had struck me down was gone. In its place was a silence so heavy it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. The bridge was a graveyard of cold metal and cooling meat. I could smell the sharp, acidic tang of Tyranid digestive enzymes eating into the floorboards, a slow, sizzling sound that punctuated the distant, organic groans of the ship's hull. The great arched windows were now obscured by thick, pulsating layers of bio-matter, as if the ship had grown a cataract of meat. I looked up and saw the ceiling dripping with a thick, translucent ichor that smelled of fermented sugar and rot. My hand found the data slate, still clutched in a grip of rigor mortis, like intensity. It was cracked, its screen a spiderweb of dead pixels, but the transmission confirmation light remained a steady, defiant green. I had sent the truth into the dark, but the dark had come to claim the messenger. I realized then that the Tyranids of the second wave were not merely killing, they were harvesting. They were moving through the ship with a surgical precision, ignoring the dead to find the living, their long needle like ovipositors ready to extract the memories of those who had witnessed the Emperor's light. They wanted the data of the divine, a blueprint of the fire that had burned them, so they could build a better armor, a thicker hide, a more resilient soul, shield. I dragged myself forward, the movement sending a white, hot spike of agony through my hip, and reached for a fallen bolt pistol. The metal was slick with the blood of a man I had known for 20 years, a navigator whose name I could no longer remember. The ship's internal vox flickered to life for a brief, haunting second. It wasn't a human voice that came through the speakers, but a synthesized mockery of a scream, a frequency designed by the Hive Mind to shatter the resolve of any survivors. It sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates, mixed with the weeping of 1,000 children. I realized the Hive Mind was no longer just a predator, it was a scholar of our suffering. It was learning how we broke, how we prayed, and how we died. I saw a group of rippers, small, worm-like organisms with rows of needle teeth, scuttling across the ceiling above me. They didn't attack, they watched. Their eyes were not the mindless beads of insects, they were windows into a vast, cold intellect that was currently dissecting my planet, my ship, and my very history. I felt a surge of cold fury. We are the masters of the galaxy, the chosen of the throne, and we were being reduced to biological data, points for a faceless hunger. I pulled myself toward the emergency venting shaft, the only path left that wasn't choked with the gray, fungal growth of the Tyranid infestation. The air in the shaft was freezing, a thin, recycled oxygen that tasted of rust and old machinery. As I crawled, I could hear the sounds of the ship being unmade around me. The bio ships were pumping millions of gallons of corrosive fluid into our fuel lines, turning the ship's own lifeblood into a solvent that would dissolve the adamantium hull from the inside out. Ocularis Prime was no longer visible, but I could feel its presence, a fading warmth in the back of my mind, like the memory of a sun after it has set. The light was gone, but the consequence of that light was still rippling through the warp. I felt the shadow in the warp thickening, a heavy, oily fog that seemed to swallow my thoughts before I could even finish them. It was a cognitive static, a psychic dampener that made every decision feel like wading through chest-deep tar. I reached the secondary engineering deck, a cavernous space dominated by the massive, Gothic heat sinks of the ship's reactor. The room was shrouded in a thick, amber haze, the light from the flickering emergency lanterns struggling to pierce the gloom. In the center of the deck, I saw them, a circle of zoanthropes, their massive, overdeveloped brains pulsing with a sickly, rhythmic light. They were floating in the air, their tiny, vestigial limbs twitching as they channeled the psychic residue of the world below. They were drinking the echoes of the Astronomican. They were filtering the holy radiance through their own warped biology, trying to find the frequency of the Emperor's will, so they could mimic it, or perhaps nullify it forever. Around them, the deck plates were warped and blackened, as if the floor itself were trying to melt away from their presence. I realized that this was the heart of the adaptation. If they succeeded here, the light of the Emperor would never again be a weapon against the swarm. It would be a dinner bell. I checked the charge on the bolt pistol. 3 rounds. Not enough to kill a zoanthrope, but enough to cause a catastrophic rupture in the primary coolant line. I looked at the massive pipes overhead, draped in thick, leathery Tyranid vines. If I could breach the seal, the liquid nitrogen would flash, freeze the entire deck, turning the zoanthropes and their psychic laboratory into a tomb of ice. It was a suicide mission, but on a ship that was already being digested, the word survival had lost all meaning. I took a ragged breath, the cold air burning my lungs, and began to aim. My hands were shaking, the weight of the pistol feeling like a mountain. The shadow in the warp was screaming at me now, a direct, mental assault that told me to stop, to surrender, to let the hunger take me. It promised peace. It promised an end to the pain. It promised that I would be part of something greater, a part of the eternal cycle of consumption and growth. I pulled the trigger. The roar of the bolt pistol was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The first round hit the valve assembly, sparks flying as the explosive tip bit into the ancient iron. The second round followed a millisecond later, punching a hole the size of a man's head into the high-pressure line. A jet of freezing white vapor erupted from the pipe, a screaming torrent of cold that instantly turned the amber haze into a blinding blizzard of frost. The zoanthropes shrieked, a sound that bypassed my ears and went straight into my brain, a psychic nails on chalkboard that made my nose bleed again. They tried to erect their psychic shields, but the physical shock of the cold was too fast, too absolute. I saw the leathery vines turn brittle and shatter like glass. I saw the pulsing brains of the Xenos frost over, their rhythmic light flickering and dying as their biological functions were suspended by the sub-zero temperatures. I slumped back against a bulkhead, watching as the frost spread across the room, a white, crystalline wave of destruction. I felt the cold touching my own skin, numbing the pain in my leg, slowing the frantic beating of my heart. I closed my eyes, a sense of grim satisfaction washing over me. I had disrupted the harvest. I had denied the Hive Mind its prize. The data slate lay beside me, its green light still glowing, a tiny, defiant star in the freezing dark. I wondered if anyone would ever find it. I wondered if the Inquisition would see my sacrifice as an act of faith or merely a tactical necessity. It didn't matter. I had done my duty. I had stood in the light, and when the light went out, I had stood in the cold. We are the defenders of the Imperium, and we do not go quietly into the maw of the beast. As the last of my warmth faded, I heard a new sound, a deep, booming resonance that shook the entire ship. It wasn't the Tyranids. It was the sound of a warp jump. A massive, localized rift was opening nearby. I opened my eyes one last time and saw the tactical display on a half-shattered monitor. A fleet was emerging from the Empyrean. Not more Tyranids. Not the grey, matte, armored ships of the second wave. These were ships of iron and gold, their hulls etched with the symbols of the Grey Knights. They had heard the signal. They had followed the light. The transmission had worked. I felt a final, fleeting moment of hope before the darkness took me. The cavalry had arrived, not to save the world, but to burn the infection out of the galaxy. Ocularis Prime would be a pyre, but it would be a holy pyre, and the Tyranids would find no sustenance in its ash. I smiled into the dark, and for the first time in a long time, the silence was peaceful. The fourth chapter of the invasion ended not with a whimper, but with the roar of 1,000 macro cannons. The Grey Knights did not hesitate. They did not negotiate. They saw a world that had been touched by the divine, and then defiled by the alien, and they knew what had to be done. They turned their guns on the reliquary of sorrows, on the orbital platforms, and on the surface of the planet itself. They were the Emperor's final mercy, the fire that follows the light. I felt the ship shudder as the first lance, Strikes tore through the upper decks. The heat of the beams a welcome contrast to the freezing cold of the engineering bay. I was being vaporized, my atoms scattered into the void, but I was dying as a man of the Imperium, unconsumed and unrecorded by the Hive Mind. I was free, and as the ship broke apart, I saw the golden light one last time, not from the planet, but from the hearts of the men who had come to finish the job. The light was still there. It would always be there. The final erasure of Ocularis Prime began not with a prayer, but with the systematic application of orbital fire. I am no longer a man in the physical sense, I am a ghost in the machine. My consciousness flickering through the dying neural links of the reliquary of sorrows as it shatters into a million jagged shards of iron and ice. I see the world below through the flickering optics of 1,000 falling debris pieces, and what I see is a vision of absolute, holy purgation. The Grey Knights did not come to reclaim this world, they came to deny it to the enemy. The Hive Mind had tried to study the light, to measure the divine and incorporate it into its own blasphemous evolution. But the chamber purity had arrived to ensure that the equation ended in zero. I watched from the perspective of a drifting sensor, a ray as the strike cruisers moved into a perfect geometric formation, their hulls glowing with a silvered psychic warding that made the remaining Tyranid ships recoil as if burned. This was the final answer to the Xenos adaptation, a force that did not just reflect the Emperor's light, but wielded it as a blade. The surface of the planet was now a sea of shifting, matte, grey chitin, the second wave having completely smothered the golden craters of the first. The specialized null beasts had succeeded in creating a canopy of psychic silence, a grey shroud that supposedly made the world invisible to the Astronomican. But they had forgotten that the Emperor's vengeance does not require a lighthouse to find its mark. I saw the first exterminatus torpedoes leave the bays of the Incorruptible. They did not look like weapons. They looked like falling stars, trailing long, elegant plumes of white, hot fire as they punched through the spore-choked clouds. They hit the primary spawning pools in the industrial wastes first. The explosion was not a simple combustion of chemicals. It was a localized collapse of reality. I saw the grey canopy of the Tyranid shadow torn apart by a shockwave of pure, sanctified heat that turned the leathery matter into translucent ash in a heartbeat. The null beasts, those arrogant anchors of the swarm's new reality, were the first to be extinguished, their massive crests shattering like cheap glass under the pressure of the imperial decree. I felt a strange, digital echo of a laugh as I watched the Hive Mind's reaction. For the first time, I sensed a true, unadulterated panic within the swarm. The calculated caution of the second wave vanished, replaced by a frantic, disorganized attempt to flee back into the void. But the Grey Knights had already closed the door. The warp rift through which they had emerged remained open, a swirling vortex of violet and gold that acted as a gravitational anchor, pulling the smaller ships into the Empyrean where the hungry spirits of the warp awaited them. It was a poetic justice that I found deeply satisfying. The predator that had come to consume everything was now being consumed by the very dimension it had tried to silence. I saw a hive ship, a monstrosity that had survived the initial golden pulse, attempt to breach the orbital blockade. It was met by a concentrated barrage of lance, fire that did not just melt its hull, but seemed to sever its connection to the warp entirely. The ship didn't explode, it simply ceased to be a living thing, its psychic pulse flatlining as it became a cold, dead hunk of meat drifting in the dark. The atmosphere of Ocularis Prime was now burning with a sustained, planetary, scale firestorm. The Promethium-based warheads had ignited the oxygen-heavy clouds, creating a global furnace that reached into every crevice and hive sewer. I watched the picked feeds from the city of San Gallo as the grand cathedral was engulfed in a pillar of white flame. The Tyranids within, those who had been feasting on the corpses of the faithful, were turned into pillars of salt and soot. There was no escape for the burrowing broods. No safety in the deep manufactorum tunnels. The heat was a living thing. A searching hand that found the secret places where the Hive Mind had hidden its genetic secrets. This was the final cost of the miracle. To save the soul of the sector, the body of Ocularis Prime had to be burned away. It was a grim, necessary logic. The kind of math that the Inquisition does in its sleep. But seeing it unfold was like watching the death of a parent. It was the end of a 10,000-year history, reduced to a set of coordinates for a final strike. As my own data links began to fail, my consciousness receding into the final, dark corners of the ship's cogitators, I felt a sudden, sharp connection to the Hive Mind one last time. It was a momentary overlap, a psychic friction caused by our shared destruction. In that instant, I felt what the Great Devourer felt, a profound, existential confusion. It could not understand why we would destroy our own world to stop it. To a race that exists only to grow and consume. The concept of a scorched earth sacrifice is an alien madness. It looked at the burning planet and saw not a victory, but a waste of resources, a failure of the biological mandate. And in that confusion, I found the ultimate triumph of humanity. We are not just a food source. We are a species that will set the entire galaxy on fire before we allow ourselves to be digested. We are the masters of the self-destructive miracle. The Tyranid is a force of nature, but the Imperium is a force of will. And will is the one thing that nature cannot account for. The last thing I saw through the ship's external cameras was the incorruptible moving slowly across the horizon of the burning world, its silver hull reflecting the orange glow of the dying planet. It looked like a guardian spirit, a cold and beautiful angel of death presiding over a funeral pyre. The transmission I had sent was now echoing across the sub-sector, carried by the psychic wake of the Grey Knight's arrival. The miracle of the light would live on in the archives of the Ordo Genos, a data, point of hope and horror that would inform the defense of 1,000 other worlds. Ocularis Prime was gone, but the knowledge of what happens when the swarm meets the sun was preserved. I felt the final bulkhead of the reliquary of sorrows buckle under the heat of the orbital bombardment, the scream of the metal a high, pure note that signaled my final release. The darkness was no longer cold, it was warm, filled with the lingering resonance of the fire. I am the witness. I am the record. I am the ash that settles on the graves of 1 billion enemies. As the ship disintegrated, I didn't feel fear. I felt a sense of completion. The Emperor had protected, not by saving our lives, but by sanctifying our deaths. He had turned our extinction into a weapon, a blinding flash of purity that had momentarily blinded the greatest predator in the universe. And as my consciousness finally dissolved into the static of the void, I saw the stars again, not as a cold, indifferent vacuum, but as a field of lights, each one a soul, each one a soldier in a war that will never end. The Tyranids are coming, and the dark is deep, but the light is older, and the light is ours. We are the fire that burns in the dark, and as long as one of us remains to strike a match, the galaxy will never truly belong to the swarm. The history of Ocularis Prime will be a footnote in the great crusade of the current age, a world listed as exterminatus in the imperial ledgers. But for those who saw the light, it will be something more. It will be the proof that the shadow can be pushed back, that the hunger can be defied, and that the God Emperor of mankind still watches over the ramparts of his empire. I am gone now, a ghost lost in the tides of the warp, but my words remain. Let them be a warning to the Xenos and a comfort to the faithful. The light is coming, and the light does not forgive. The final sensor on the bridge flared white, and then went dark, leaving nothing but the silence of the void and the distant, fading roar of a world that refused to be eaten.